I'm using this term because I'm going to collect some information from the client in the form of a document. All these are good characteristics of an SRS documentation. What is the requirements of a client and what is expected from the system? That is going to be considered as the correctness of a system. We must have used only prompt everywhere or only queue everywhere in the document. Hello everyone, a warm welcome to one and all. It is Dr. Ravikumar YB, Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram First Grade College, MYSURU, the Temple of Excellence. In today's session, you will learn about the software requirement specification. So what is the meaning of software requirement specifications? Let me clarify you that. In the requirement stage of the software development process is the requirement specification, that is the SRS. In short, I will call it as SRS, also called as the required documents is documented by the documenter, that is called as the SRS documentation. This report lays a foundation for software engineering activities and is constructing when entire requirements are elicited and analyzed. What is the meaning of elicited? Asking questions to client. Is called elicitation. That is the process of asking questions to client is called elicitation. I'm using this term because I'm going to collect some information from the client in the form of a document. So which acts as a presentation of software that enables the customers to review whether its SRS is according to the requirements or not. Also, it compromises user requirements for a system as well as detailed specifications of the system requirements. What does this mean? It comprises of user requirements, which includes the detailed specifications of the system requirements. What as to the system must meet, all those detailed information along with the user requirements are considered together in a document called software requirement specification. So the SRS is a specification of a specific software product, program, or a set of applications that perform for particular functions in a specific environment. It serves the several goals depending on who is writing it. First, the SRS could be written by the client of a system. Second, the SRS could be written by a developer of the system. Please make a note of this point. First, the SRS is given in the form of a request to the developer. The developer in turn writes and elicitates the client or customer and includes the detailed information or the detailed requirements of a client. In a document called SRS. Now, the two methods create entirely various situations and establish different purposes for the document altogether. The first case is the SRS is used to define the needs and expectations of the user, as I have already told you that. This is the first thing and this is the second thing. So the second case is SRS is written for the various purposes and serves as a contract document between a customer and a developer. So this is the second case. So if you look at this picture, you will clearly understand which are the different characteristics of a good SRS. The first important thing, let me consider the thing which is there inside this first level of characteristic. Correctness is one of the important characteristic. Completeness is another important characteristic. Consistency, unambiguousness. I am not using the ambiguousness. It is unambiguousness. Ranking for importance. All these are characteristics of a good SRS. Then I will move to the right level of abstraction. Modifiability, verifiability, traceability, testability, design independence, and understandable by the customer. All these are good characteristics of an SRS documentation process. Now, if I see that the first one is correctness, which is that correctness. User review is used to provide the accuracy of requirements stated in the SRS. SRS is said to be a perfect if it covers all the methods that are truly expected from the system. What is the requirements of a client and what is expected from the system? That is going to be considered as the correctness of a system, which is considered as a completeness. Once when all of the requirements are met, we say that the documentation is meeting every requirement of a client. Then we say that it is complete. All essential requirements, whether relating to functionality, performance, design constraints, attributes, or external interfaces, are all considered here for measuring the completeness of the project, software project. So if that is the case, which is the next thing? Consistency. The SRS is consistent if and only if no subset of individual requirements described in its conflict. There are three types of possible conflicts in SRS while documenting it. The first one is the specified characteristics of a real-world objects may conflicts. For example, the format of an output report may be described in one requirement as tabular but in another as textual. In few of the documents, they will write down the requirements in this tabular form. Requirement numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is the client's requirement. The same client's requirement are written in the form of a textual description. Then again, the format of this is different. That is the output format. Since it is described in tabular form, I am going to represent it in textual form. If the document is transferred from one person to another person, he may feel inconsistent with the description defined in the tabular form with the description defined in the textual form, that is in the paragraph-like form. So that is one of the conflict. The other conflict is the condition may state that all the lights shall be green, while another states that all lights should be blue. That is, if there is any condition that if certain conditions like if statement are all represented in green color, then it has to be represented. Where should the definition, where should the condition is to be applied, and where should the looping statement should be applied. The looping statement, all these must be applied in blue color. So this represents that using the GUI in the form of a GUI, graphical user interface, in some of the buttons are represented in green color, and few of the buttons are check boxes. Checkbox text is represented in blue color. If I use green color for both, that becomes a conflict. Both buttons and checkboxes, that becomes a conflict. So second important thing is reasonable or temporal conflict between the two specified actions. For example, one of the condition is one requirement may determine that the program will add two inputs and another may determine that the program will multiply them. That is, the parameter values passed as parameter 1 and 2 are used, and the third one is as a computation of this 1 and 2, it returns a single result. That is the conflict. Then one condition may state that A must always follows B, while other requires that A and B co-occurs. That means both A and B co-occurs. That means occurs simultaneously. But in the other thing, what is that? A must follow B. That means first B, then A follows. What happens if there is a condition with function definition with certain parameters? Param1, param2, so on. Then the parsing of these begins from right to left. So it uses a data structure called stack, which is the attribute that is defined at last, that is param2, that goes to the bottom of the stack. Then this goes to the next position, that is param2, param1. So we have two parameters here. During the time of execution, this must be popped out and the values must be computed. That is param1 star param2 is going to be considered here and applied to some variable C. Variable C. So this is how we are going to obtain. The third scenario, in which two or more requirements may define the same real-world object but use different terms for that object. For example, see here, a program's request for user input may be called as prompt. I am using the word prompt here to indicate the user's request in one of the requirements. In another requirement, they will call it as a queue. So there is a conflict again. Here they are using the word prompt and here they are using the word queue. So this is not consistent with the terms used in the document. So in order to make it consistent, we must have used only prompt everywhere or only queue everywhere in the document. So the consistency is maintained. Then unambiguousness, that means there must not be any dilemma. That is, SRS is an unambiguous when every fixed requirement has only one interpretation. That is only one interpretation. This suggests that each element is uniquely interpreted. This well defines unambiguousness property or the characteristic of a good SRS document. In this case, there is a method used with multiple definitions. The requirements report should determine the implications in the SRS so that it is clear and simple to understand. So, which is that? Fifth characteristic, ranking for importance and stability. What is the meaning of ranking? This SRS is ranked for importance and stability if the requirements in it as an identifier to indicate either the significance or the stability of that particular requirement. Suppose the client has some requirements, that is requirement 1, requirement 2, requirement 3, so on till requirement n. So how many requirements are there? N number of requirements are there. So each of these must be identified uniquely by the identifier. Which is that identifier? It has an identifier to indicate that the significance or stability of that particular requirement. That is, requirement 1 is to be identified with an identifier ID1. This must be identified with ID2. ID3, so on up to IDN. So we have these options here. Which is the next important characteristic? modifiable. Suppose at some later point of time, if he wants to incorporate few changes into the existing system, then there must be a provision to do the modifications in the document, SRS document. That is called as modifiability. That is of quickly obtaining the changes to the system to some extent. Modifications should be perfectly indexed and cross-referenced. Verifiability, this is done at the time of unit testing by the software developer and by the testing team to verify whether all of the requirements are met or not. The same thing is explained here. SRS is correct when the specified requirements can be verified with cost-effective system to check whether the final software meets those requirements. That is called as the testing team does the task of this. Then the requirements are verified with the help of reviews. Then what is the meaning of traceability? You may have heard about the traceability. Traceability feature indicates that if there is a flow of control from one block to another block, that is from if block to else block, then it has to be traceable. If it is within the for loop, end for, then it must be traceable. That based upon this condition, how many iterations the set of statements are going to be executed is determined. That is called as a traceable. The SRS is traceable if the origin of each of the requirements is clear, and if it facilitates the referencing of each condition in future development or enhanced documentation. That improvises the quality of a SRS document. There are two types of traceability. The first one is backward traceability, then the other one is forward traceability. When it is called as a backward traceability, this backward traceability depends upon each requirement explicitly referencing its source in earlier documents. Please make a note of this point, that is the documentation which is done earlier is considered as a reference. But in case of forward traceability, there is no such thing. This depends upon each element in the SRS having a unique name or reference number. As I have already told you that this is identified by some unique identifiers. Each of these must be referenced like this. That is called as forward traceability. Then the forward traceability of the SRS is especially crucial when the software product enters the operation and maintenance. That is, after the delivery of this software to the client, this forward reference becomes very difficult, and it is crucial also. It is important as well. As code and design document is modified, it is necessary to be able to ascertain the complete set of requirements that may be concerned by these modifications. Because suppose if there is any minor modifications, if there is any major modifications, that has to be reflected immediately in the SRS, so that the next version of software, that is V2, version 2, shall be considered and verified with version 1 software. That is called as this forward traceability. Then design independence. That means what? Multiple design alternatives for the final system are to be defined. Specifically, the SRS should not contain any implementation details. Whether it is a coding or not must not be implemented. Coding must not be implemented or mentioned in the SRS document. In the SRS document. Then what about the testability? Testability is done by the testing team as well as the development team. So an SRS should be written in such a manner that it is simple to generate the test cases and test plans from the report. Usually you people may have seen that the test report consists of test cases. Test case 1, test case 2, test case 3, so on up to test case n. What is the meaning of this? Suppose for the test case 1, what is the possible output generated? For test case 2, what is the output generated? Suppose if there is any exception, kindly make a note of this exception or mistakes that has identified. Then what is this output 3? Then what is the exception or the mistake? Exception or the mistake identified. All these things must be noted. That is output n. All these things must be noted and given back to the developer. If there is any major or minor changes required. Major or minor changes required. That is based on this testability feature. Then understandable by the customer. It has to be written in such a way that the report written by the developer is understandable to the end user or to the client. Maybe an expert is or are explicit domain but might not be trained in computer science. So that is the reason we are going to consider that the understandability feature. Hence, the purpose of the formal notations and symbols should be avoided to as much extent as possible. The language should be kept simple and clear. Please make a note of this. You have to use these words here. Language must be simple and clear. To indicate the understandable feature to the client. So with this, I have the 11th type of good characteristic, that is the right level of abstraction. What is the meaning of abstraction? As I have already discussed with you, an abstraction indicates that only the brief information of that is going to be given to the client and the detailed information is kept with the company. That is called as the right level of abstraction. That is the feasibility study and fewer analysis can be used, hence the level of abstraction modifies according to the objective of the SRS. That is how we are going to do the documentation in case of software requirement specification. My dear students, I hope you are all following really well. Thank you very much. Thank you one and all.